Have you ever wondered where humanity started? I know there's um, a lot of answers out there, and the most popular answer would be from the secular um, scientists and the evolutionists' ideas, right, of where um, humanity started, but the Bible tells us that God created Adam and Eve, and they were in the Garden of Eden. And then, when um, after they disobeyed, God took them out of that garden. And so, but then you have some Christians, and I'm not saying all Christians, but I can see where some, think that the Garden of Eden is kind of like a spiritual realm. And, like after Adam and Eve disobeyed, God took that spiritual realm away, and like we just can't see it anymore. Um, and that is a very possible, explanation to why nobody has found the Garden of Eden, right? However, the Bible tells us about four rivers. There's We can clearly see two of the four rivers today, right? And so that would suggest that the Garden of Eden was literally here, like actually on this earth. Now the other two rivers are simply, nobody has, found them. There are, those people that, claim that they found the other two rivers, but the problem is if you look at different maps, and I've done this before, um, I've looked at different maps where, they've, placed the two missing rivers, like the Pishon River. One map will show the Pishon at like X location, and then the other will map shows it at another location. So that's a little bit of a problem. And so, anyways, I'm going to circle back to that, and I'm getting a little off track, but that would suggest that it was in fact a land, like a territory here on earth. Another interesting fact that would suggest that the Garden of Eden was a territory here on earth is that the Bible describes that the Garden of Eden was located where? In Eden. Meaning Eden itself was a territory. You got Eden. You got this territory named Eden, and then inside somewhere in this territory of Eden, you have the Garden of Eden. So how big is this territory? Nobody knows how big this territory would have been. And then it's interesting. So whenever God, after Adam and Eve disobeyed God, he took them out of the garden. But because we know now that Eden was a territory, Adam and Eve were still in Eden. They still lived in Eden. In fact, we know this because after Cain kills Abel, where does Cain go? He goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden. So, in order for him to go east of Eden, Eden would have had to been a territory here on earth before the flood. And Nod also would have had to have been a territory here on earth before the flood. Now, yes, the flood changed a lot of things. There's a lot of things that the flood changed. And so it kind of makes it difficult to actually find where Eden was located or would have been located. But we know that the Garden of Eden would have been located in the territory of Eden. So, we have to rethink how to find Eden. I'm suggesting that we have to rethink, because oftentimes, and in my early studies, I did this as well. In my earliest studies, way back, I don't know exactly when I started, but I too did this. I went straight to the Bible and I looked at the four rivers, and I've tried so hard to find the four rivers. What I am suggesting is that we literally cannot, because there's a problem. We only have two of the four locations for the rivers. So that's a little bit of a problem, or a huge problem. So my suggestion, and this is simply what I have found helpful, actually, is not looking to find the four rivers. No. And I know there's many that there's some Christians that don't believe that the book of Enoch should be added to the Bible because it's not doctrine well, they don't have any evidence for that. In fact, I do have videos on my channel talking about how it actually does teach doctrine. It teaches everything. So everything that they say that the Book of Enoch doesn't teach, it actually does. And so then I also have videos explaining, other arguments that people have said, explaining that there's no evidence for those arguments, and just other arguments saying that, well, the Book of Enoch, there's a section or two where they're praying to angels or something, or praying to Enoch. Well, you got a lot of the Old Testament full of, even before the Jews became a nation, you have their ancestors. You go all the way back to Abram. Abram came from a land of Ur, so I'm confident him, Isaac, Isaac's, children, you have Jacob and Esau, and I'm sure down the road, you have Israel's ancestors, most likely worshiping not just God Himself, but carrying false gods with them. Now, obviously, we get to the Exodus and things like that, and that's where God says they can no longer, serve these other gods, right? But, yeah, throughout all Genesis, you see where, but then even, did you also know this? That King Saul approached a medium, approached somebody that talks to the dead. And so, that part is in the Bible. And so, but there's arguments saying that, well, because, somewhere in here they pray to angels, that, oh, well, it shouldn't, therefore it's not doctrine, therefore it's not orthodox or whatever. And I just don't see, it's like, well, again, there's plenty in the Old Testament where they're praying to different gods. Saul goes to a medium, right? And so I don't know what their argument is. They don't really. So, but there's a lot of videos that I do, explaining how the Book of Enoch really is, one book that I have found that really should be put in Scripture. Now, there's other books like the Book of Jubilees. And yeah, the Book of Jubilees could have been written by Jews. However, the Book of Jubilees, I found it kind of not really. There's some things in there that doesn't really add up to what the Scripture talks about in the Bible. Um, because yeah, like you because just because the book of Jubilees would have been possibly written by Jews, that doesn't mean that they got the story, like the biblical story would be accurate, and the so the book of Jubilees also has, kind of this Exodus kind of like story where they're in the desert and Moses is talking to the Lord, just like the, Exodus account where they're, in the desert and things like that. But then I got to a place where it kind of contradicted some of the things that were so just because the book of Jubilees was written by the Jews doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate. And the only things that they're going to put in the Bible would be 100% accurate. This is what happened. So the reason why the book of Jubilees is not of the Bible is because it's not historically accurate. This book, however, I clearly, um, it's pretty historically accurate. Um, it's really historically accurate. But, anyways, that's a side note. Go check out those videos on my channel about the Book of Enoch and why I believe we need to be paying more attention to the Book of Enoch, and things like that. So you can go check that out on my channel. So, the Book of Enoch, you get to a place where the Book of Enoch explains, 7 islands, and these islands are bigger than, any other island. And you type it in to Google and you can find these islands. In fact, there's, and I'm not going to open up to it, but it tells us that there's like, I think around 5 of these islands that are, you know, kind of, outland. They're not, they're further out, they're out in the ocean. And in fact, they are. There's there's 5 islands bigger than any other that are actually um, out in the ocean. And then so in the book of Enoch, it talks about there are 2 islands, um, I believe. Maybe it could be 4 and 3. I forget exactly the exact number, and I'm not going to go to it because I'm not going to waste a whole bunch of time on this subject. But it tells, and again, when I did the research, I did find the same amount of islands that are inland. Um, and so I started to notice that in the book of Enoch, when you come to the 7 islands, the 7 rivers that are bigger than any other river, the 7 mountain peaks that are higher than any other mountain peak, that it's laying out, it's kind of telling us, or it's kind of narrowing down, where Enoch is traveling. So starting with the islands, these 7 islands, you find that he's pretty much, boom, this is where he's at. And the 7 rivers, bigger, and again, when you look at the 7 islands, like, boom, this is the area that he's talking about. Like, this is a big area. So we have to narrow it down. Well, the 7 biggest rivers are not actually 7 biggest rivers here on Earth. It's the 7 biggest rivers within this area. So within this huge area, and that's a big area, where are the 7 biggest rivers in that area? Well, you narrow it down to about this. So you have Afghanistan, India, you have China, you have Russia, you have, the European countries, you have the Asian country, you just narrowed it down. So you went from here to here, right? You narrowed it down. Those are the 7 greatest rivers in that area. So then the 7 greatest, or biggest, like, highest mountain peaks would be, you narrow it down, they would be right in here, right? Simply, that's pretty simple. So why do I circle that area? Is because a lot of people say that the Mediterranean Sea, or the Iranian Sea, excuse me, listed in the book of Enoch, they say that it's there. Wrong. That's not where Enoch is. The 7 greatest mountain peaks, again, are in this location. They're in this location. So when it says in the book of Enoch, he goes over these mountain peaks, he's talking about going over, like, when he goes over the summits of these mountains, he's talking about the 7 highest mountain peaks. That's the summit of mountains that he's going over. And he's going where? To the east. So I believe his journey starts somewhere here, but it ends up somewhere here. Before going over the Ephraim Sea, his journey ends up here before going over the Ephraim Sea. So that is why the Ephraim Sea is not this location, but the Ephraim Sea would be this location. That's just an interesting fact that I want to clear up before moving forward. And so now you know that the China Sea would be the Ephraim Sea. So from there, you can go east and you can boop, put your finger right there. Take this, move east, and well, you kind of come here, right? So that's just, I'm not saying that that's the location. I'm not saying that that's the location. But what I am saying is it's interesting when you kind of draw a straight line, that's where you land. That's all I'm saying. So I'm not saying that that's the location. I'm just saying that that's where you land. That's where you land. And so, and again, before the flood, the world was different. That's something that you have to be thinking about. Is the world before the flood was different. And so there's a lot of things that would be different. However, the one thing that I believe would not be different is the location. I mean, I think there's a reason why California is home to the largest trees here on Earth. And I don't know, before the flood, could there have been trees even larger than the red oak or redwood trees? Probably. I understand that. Like, I understand that there are trees that don't exist anymore because of the flood. But all we have is what we know. And in order to tell the story of what happened before the flood to now, we have to find Eden. Finding Eden is going to tell us where Nod is. Finding Eden is going to tell us where Nod is. And if we can find Nod, the area of Nod, like if we can find the territory of Nod, we can find where Noah and his family lived. Because I don't believe Noah and his family would have lived very far from the land Nod. Now, at this time, yes, the earth was populated. So the earth was populated. The earth would have been populated, and we have evidence of that because and this is new, and this study that I'm about to tell you has been done by, and I forget her name, but and I don't know what her beliefs are, but it would be done by a secular, like, I'm not saying that she would believe, probably does believe in evolution. I don't know, if her focus is, oh yes, evolution is definitely, or somebody that would be, because there are some people that, believe in evolution that keep their mind open to the things that the creationists study. And here in a little bit, I do have a book in front of me that I, want to share. But I'll get to that here shortly. And I forget who she is, and I don't know exactly what her beliefs are, but she is also I forget what field of science she's in, but she, on her spare time, she likes to go diving. Uh, and she was diving at Lake Mendota. And Lake Mendota, like, it is in Wisconsin. It's actually 45 minutes south of where I live. Um, and so she found canoes that some of them date back 4,500 years. Now, obviously, she has come out and said that they're canoes from Indian tribes and they would have, submerged the canoes during winter and, to preserve the wood. However, you do know that submerging wood underwater is actually it does not preserve wood. But then also the climate back then would have been, the climate 3,000, 4,000 years ago would have been different. Like, they probably did not have winter at all. Like, it's a possibility with that climate, because that would have been, even 3,000 years ago, which I don't know exactly when the Ice Age was, I guess, but, I do believe you're even going before the Ice Age. And I said this on my channel before in short films and, different videos, that before the Ice Age, the Earth's climate would have been very, very warm. In fact, it would have been so warm that nowhere on Earth would have been, you know, there wouldn't have been any snow. Um, the winters would have been fairly warm. And how do I know this? How do I know this? Well, before the Ice Age, you have Antarctica. That was a tropical island. Before the Ice Age, you have where it was a tropical island. Antarctica was literally a tropical island. Grass grew, trees grew. It was a place where many living creatures once lived. And yes, you do have the polar bear and penguin. But obviously, their body fat allows them to continue to live there. But before the Ice Age, you would have had a lot more vegetation and animals living on Antarctica because it would have been a tropical island. And it would have frozen over during the Ice Age. During the Ice Age, it would have frozen over. And the ice is still there today. The ice at Antarctica is from the Ice Age that the world had. But how do I know? Not only just because Antarctica would have been a tropical island, what else is there? Well, we know that if Antarctica would have been a tropical island, the rest, the whole globe would have been a lot warmer than it is today. How do I know that? Well, we do have something called the equator, and the closer and closer you get to the equator, the warmer and warmer the temperature, right? And so going back down to Antarctica being down here, well, that's the reason why it's still ice, is because, well, the globe's temperature is not near the temperature that it was before the Ice Age, because the equator is up here, and the further south you go from the equator, the cooler and cooler it's going to get until you get to Antarctica. You're going to be below, you're going to be way in the negatives, right? Because it's the furthest away from the equator. And then as you go from Antarctica all the way up to it's going to get warmer and warmer. And then if you go north of the equator, it's going to get cooler and cooler. We know that. So going back to when Antarctica was a tropical island, well, still, same thing. You go north, it's going to get hotter and hotter. Well, it's simple common sense that the Earth before the Ice Age was very, very warm. So, therefore, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, the Earth's climate would have been pretty warm, actually. Very warm. Um, there wouldn't have been a need for, trying to preserve the canoes um, during the winter months. There wouldn't have been a need for that because it would have been warm enough. They could have just, kept the canoes in shade, right? But then some of the canoes, they were able to date back as far as 4,500 years. Well, that's getting pretty close to the time of the flood. That is getting really, really close to the time of the flood. So, if there were humans living at Lake Mendota before the flood, that's evidence that this was a global flood. That's also evidence that humans were around the whole entire globe. Because nobody before this discovery, well, other than the creationists, other than people that have always believed in the flood and 6-day creation, nobody else had ever thought that humans would have been living in the land that we call America 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Like, we all just assumed that the oldest people living was, from the land we call Africa. Well, here they have found evidence that people, tribes, have came from Lake Mendota here in Wisconsin. So that does suggest that there were people living, tribes living here in America 3,000, 4,000 years ago, and maybe even going back 5,000, 6,000 years, right? So, where am I going with this? Where am I going? Is it possible that Noah and his family came from Lake Mendota? Now, we don't know that. We don't have evidence for that yet. Or I don't, well, I mean, I got things that will blow your mind. I wouldn't necessarily call them evidence, but I got things that will blow your mind. And yes, the world is different. And yes, the oldest artifacts that we find is, kind of here in the Middle East, that's kind of like the oldest artifacts that we found. Well, those artifacts, do they date back to 5,000 years or 4,000 years? I don't know. So, what I'm suggesting is they're finding evidence that that's kind of where people settled once Noah and his family got off the ark. They don't know where the ark came from. They don't know, like, there's some speculation that it came from South Africa. Um, which is actually possible. But I'm going to show you something that I'm not saying is evidence, but I'm going to show you something that will blow your mind. Let's go back to Lake Mendota. So Lake Mendota might be somewhere around, it's kind of hard to tell on this globe, but it might be somewhere around there, right? So let's do this. Let's put our finger, and I don't like how not able to give a presentation like other people. But you put your finger, and actually I wish I had more like a pencil or pen, but you put your finger right where about Lake Mendota is, and it's about right there. Turn, 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 turn. Oh, where did we come to? Ooh, didn't we come to Turkey? Didn't we land at Turkey? And isn't it funny that the ark landed on a mountain peak in Turkey? Are you blown away? Is your mind blown? Well, okay, maybe not blown completely out of the water yet. When you go to Google Earth and you type in Noah's Ark, and we don't know which way the front would be facing, although I do speculate that the front would be facing east and the back would be facing west. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell, but over towards this side of the arc is actually, like, if you look at it closely, it is more pointed, and that typically suggests that that would be the front, and this side is more rounded, and so we know, you know, every boat, big or small, the backside is what is more rounded than the front. The front is usually pointed. And so just by looking at that, now I don't have eyes and boots. So, but that's just my speculation looking at Google Earth, is that the front would be facing east. But it's interesting how it's pointed east to west or west to east. It's not pointed north and south, it's pointed east and west. And so we do know that the arc can only travel one direction. The arc, there's no steering mechanism. There was no way they could have steered the arc. So, yes, it would have got pushed around by the waves a little bit. We can expect that. But mostly, we can expect it to go on a straight path. Well, let's go back to what I just showed you. The arc is pointing east and west, right? It's pointing east and west, not north and south. So that tells you that it was most likely traveling from the west to the east. Well, it's interesting when you go back to what I said about when you start at Lake Mendota and you trace and you land up in Turkey. And you just put those two things together. Boom, mind blown. So, why do I bring all of this up? I bring all of this up before going to this book and I'm not very far into this book. I'm only in page 13. But this book brought me back to the study that I have done on where Noah and his family would have, what part of the world were they located, right? And my belief that they would have been located probably near the land of Nod. And am I saying that Wisconsin would have been the land of Nod? No, no, I'm not suggesting that. However, again, we need to find Eden before we can find Nod. But what I'm saying is it's very interesting how from the book of Enoch, where Enoch was, when you go east, or yeah, when you go east from where he was, where you land, and then from Lake Mendota, you go east of that to Turkey and where you land there. It just blew my mind. And so that's what I'm saying is hopefully that is blowing your mind. And so where did Noah and his family come from? We don't know. Nobody has been able to find Eden. Nobody has been able to find Nod. There have been claims, but the research that I've done, well, kind of, you know, you would be surprised that maybe where they say might not be any evidence for. And again, yes, the land would have been different, but there would have been a lot of differences, but that doesn't mean that the location still would have been right where, boom. Like, so if Lake Mendota, really, it does turn out that the evidence really does point to Lake Mendota being the land of Nod. And again, not saying that it is, but if the evidence points to that, you know, what I'm saying is yes, you have a lot of changes, but the location would not change. The like their God would have left evidence. There would have been evidence after the flood to find Eden and to find Nod. Like, just because there was a flood doesn't mean the location just disappears. Like, you still have the location of Nod. You still have somewhere out there is the location of Eden. Where is that location? I believe that location probably could be somewhere beneath the ocean. I think during the flood probably did destroy Eden and caused Eden to sink beneath the ocean. That's one of my thoughts. My other thought is that, yeah, let's go to the book of Enoch, follow where the path that he took, and maybe that would be Eden. Because if you think about it, Wisconsin really is east. So, like, where you land, like, if you follow Enoch's path east, you do land up about right there. And yes, Wisconsin is north. It's northeast. It's not due east. It's, northeast. But maybe the land of Nod could be just south. Bring this over here. What if it's just south of Wisconsin? And what if Noah and his family traveled north to Lake Mendota? That's a possibility that they could have traveled north to Lake Mendota and had tribes there, you know, um, that's just a possibility. And I'm not saying, but so this book that I'm reading is called Traced. And I haven't got too far in this book, but I've always been curious, and this is the reason why I got this book, is to maybe I would find answers to where, so in the Bible, it tells you that Noah's three sons, started the, you know, populations, right? Like every population can be traced back to Noah and his three sons. And then they can be traced back to Adam and Eve. Um, I've always had a curiosity of where those. So you take the three sons of Noah; they're the ones that populated, you know, the world. And so I've always been fascinated on, okay, where did the tribes that are related to Ham, where did they end up? Right? And I've looked at different maps and things like that and kind of always been on the fence at what I've been told. Like, okay, Ham's, heritage went here. Okay, this son, that heritage went, down here or whatever. I've always been on the fence, always, just curious. And so that's the reason why when I saw this, so first I saw a short film of the author of this book, a short film, you know, and that led me to buy this book. And so hopefully I will get some of those answers. But I've always been curious to also know where Noah and his family came before the flood. Because obviously I hold a different belief. So there's a lot that, because we're finding the earliest artifacts around here, you know, there's a belief that that's where, you know, humanity started even before the flood. I've never held that belief. And again, just watching this video, you can see why I don't really hold to that belief, because I believe the artifacts that they're finding would be artifacts, like after the flood. I mean, if they landed, somewhere in Turkey, it's like obviously that area, that radius, yeah, that um, obviously that's where um, your oldest artifacts are going to show up, because they're artifacts after the flood, that they're finding artifacts that would be you know after the flood. um I don't really believe we have found any artifact, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they have found artifacts that um, were before the flood. But just because, like, so think about this. Just because they have found artifacts that probably could date back before the flood, well, that would be evidence that the earth was populated. I mean, that's not necessarily evidence that that's where Noah and his family were from. Um, it's simple. Just look at, like, one, the ark landed on the east side of that mountain, facing west and east. So it's kind of impossible that it would have came from the south. So really, it would have came from somewhere, a territory from the west, somewhere from the west, you know, and so this book traces the heritage of where each civilization started. Well, nobody has really been able to find where Noah and his family came from. Um, and what I'm saying is there's a slight possibility that I have cracked that. I mean, there's a possibility that this author has cracked the code of where the Indians, you know, have, came from. And I don't know if I'm going to find where they come from in this book, but there's another book that you can pre-order, and so I'm eventually going to order that book as well, take a look at it. And but he claims that he has cracked the code. And that's what I'm saying is I believe I have cracked the code to where um, Eden could be, where the land of Nod could be, where Noah and his family could have been, you know, before the flood. And because it's not, they didn't just, come from the Middle East, the flood happened, and boom, they're in Turkey. That does not make any sense when you look at the where the ark is facing. Um, the ark facing west to east suggests that the ark came from a territory in the west. So that's but I do believe that with this code that this author has cracked, and hopefully at some point people will start paying attention to the study that I have done to crack the code of where Noah and his family came from. And so hopefully with me cracking the code, hopefully, I can get people to pay closer attention. And so that's seriously all this video comes down to, is just you know, put it out there so that sometime later, uh, maybe a creationist would find this video, or something, and people will start paying attention to the study that I have done, because it, we couldn't we can't have came from the Middle East. That's just way too close to Turkey. Plus, that is south of Turkey, and the ark is facing west to east. And so there's just no possible way that the ark came from the Middle East, traveled north to Turkey. There's no evidence for that. And so, yes, I do believe that most of the artifacts that they are finding are indeed artifacts, you know, after the flood. And again, it's interesting how we now know that there were canoes that they've dated some 4,500 years ago. So we need to start looking at that as evidence.